They saw a compassionate volunteer who never left anyone's side during medical crises. She was actually a decorated Army combat medic who had earned the Silver Star in Afghanistan. They saw someone who understood grief and fear better than anyone else. She was someone who had faced both on battlefields where life and death decisions happened in seconds. The staff at Memorial Hospital had no idea their most beloved volunteer was also one of their most decorated veterans. Welcome to Daily Soldier Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of service, sacrifice, and the different ways we heal each other, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe heroes come in many forms, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Memorial Hospital in Denver, Colorado, operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, handling everything from routine surgeries to life-threatening emergencies. In the controlled chaos of a major medical center, there were dozens of staff members whose work kept the institution running. Doctors, nurses, technicians, administrators, and support personnel who each played crucial roles in patient care. But there was one person who occupied a unique space in the hospital ecosystem. Margaret Chen, a volunteer who had been working in the Family Support Services Department for 8 years. At 52, Margaret had the kind of presence that made people feel calmer just by being in the same room with her, a combination of professional competence and genuine warmth that was particularly valuable in high-stress medical situations. Margaret's official role was to provide support to families during medical crises, but her actual function went far beyond anything described in the volunteer handbook. She was the person staff called when a family was struggling to understand a difficult diagnosis, when children needed someone to sit with them during a parent's surgery, when elderly patients had no visitors and needed human connection during their recovery. What made Margaret extraordinary at this work wasn't just her compassion, though she had that in abundance, but her uncanny ability to understand exactly what families were experiencing during medical emergencies. She seemed to know instinctively when people needed information, when they needed silence, when they needed someone to hold their hand, and when they needed someone to help them make impossible decisions. Margaret just gets it, Dr. Sarah Martinez, a trauma surgeon, had told colleagues on multiple occasions. She understands what families are going through in ways that the rest of us can't. Sometimes I think she's been through everything these people are experiencing. Other staff members had noticed the same thing. Margaret's responses to crisis situations weren't those of someone who had learned appropriate protocols through training. They were the responses of someone who had personal experience with trauma, loss, and the kind of fear that came with life and death situations. When the Rodriguez family's teenage son was brought in after a motorcycle accident, Margaret had sat with them for 12 hours, somehow knowing exactly when to encourage hope and when to help them prepare for the possibility of loss. When elderly Mrs. Patterson had been alone during emergency heart surgery, Margaret had stayed with her through the night, holding her hand and talking her through the fear that comes with waking up connected to machines in an unfamiliar place. These weren't isolated incidents. Margaret approached every family crisis with the same combination of competence and empathy, as if she had an endless capacity for absorbing other people's fear and converting it into something manageable. What the staff at Memorial Hospital didn't know was that Margaret Chen's understanding of medical crises came from 8 years of volunteering, but her understanding of life and death situations came from somewhere else entirely. 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan as an Army combat medic, where she had earned the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism under enemy fire. Margaret had never mentioned her military background to anyone at the hospital. As far as they knew, she was a retired administrative assistant who had decided to spend her retirement volunteering to help others. The truth was more complex. Margaret was a medically retired Army medic who had found a way to continue serving without wearing a uniform or carrying a weapon. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been working at Memorial Hospital for 6 years, long enough to recognize exceptional people when she encountered them. As a trauma surgeon, Sarah had seen how different people responded to medical crises, and she'd learned to appreciate those rare individuals who could provide genuine comfort during the worst moments of people's lives. Margaret Chen was in a category by herself. In Sarah's experience, there were good volunteers who followed protocols and provided adequate support, and there were exceptional volunteers who seemed to intuitively understand what families needed. Margaret was beyond exceptional. She was someone who approached family support work with the kind of calm authority usually associated with medical professionals who had decades of crisis experience. What puzzled Sarah was that Margaret's volunteer file indicated she had no medical background. According to her application, she had worked in administrative roles for most of her career and had decided to volunteer at the hospital after retiring. But Margaret's responses to medical emergencies suggested someone who had extensive experience with trauma situations. Sarah had observed Margaret during dozens of crisis situations, and her behavior patterns were those of someone who had been trained to function under extreme pressure. Margaret never seemed overwhelmed by chaos, never appeared rattled by bad news, and never hesitated when families needed immediate emotional support during rapidly changing medical situations. The opportunity to learn more about Margaret's background came accidentally on a Thursday afternoon in November. Sarah had been looking for Margaret to help with a family whose father was in critical condition after a construction accident, and she'd been told that Margaret was in the volunteer office updating patient family contact information. Sarah approached the volunteer office, intending to knock and ask Margaret to come to the ICU family room. But the door was slightly ajar, and Sarah could see Margaret sitting at her desk, working on paperwork with the methodical precision that characterized everything she did. What caught Sarah's attention wasn't Margaret's work habits. She'd observed those many times before, but something on the wall behind Margaret's desk that Sarah had never noticed during previous visits to the volunteer office. It was a framed certificate, official-looking, mounted on the wall in a position where it would be visible to Margaret while she worked, but not necessarily noticeable to casual visitors. From her angle in the doorway, Sarah could see enough of the document to realize it was some kind of military commendation, but she couldn't read the details. Sarah knocked on the doorframe and entered when Margaret looked up. "Margaret, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a family in the ICU who could really use your help. Construction accident, father of 3, touch and go." Margaret immediately stood up and began gathering the materials she typically brought to family support situations: tissues, notepads, contact information for social services, and a small card with phone numbers for chaplain services. "Of course," Margaret said. "What do they know so far?" As Margaret organized her materials, Sarah found herself glancing again at the certificate on the wall. Now that she was closer, she could see that it was definitely a military decoration, but the specific details were still unclear from her angle. "Multiple trauma, internal bleeding, they're doing everything they can, but it's going to be a long night," Sarah said, then hesitated before adding, "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I couldn't help noticing the certificate on your wall. Is that military?" Margaret paused in her preparation, perhaps realizing that her carefully maintained privacy about her military background was about to be compromised. "Yes," she said simply, "from a long time ago." Sarah waited for Margaret to elaborate, but when she didn't, Sarah's medical training in asking difficult questions took over. "What branch?" Sarah asked gently. "Army. I was a medic." The information hit Sarah like a revelation. Margaret's intuitive understanding of medical crises, her calm under pressure, her ability to communicate with families during traumatic situations. It all made perfect sense if she had been a military medic. "How long did you serve?" Sarah asked. Margaret looked directly at Sarah, perhaps recognizing that her secret was out and deciding that honesty was the best approach. 12 years active duty, 3 deployments to Afghanistan, medically retired in 2016. Sarah felt her understanding of Margaret shift completely. The volunteer she'd been working with for 6 years wasn't just someone with natural empathy for families in crisis. She was a trained medical professional who had dealt with trauma situations under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. "Margaret, why didn't you ever mention this? Your medical background would have been incredibly valuable information for the hospital administration." Margaret was quiet for a moment, perhaps trying to articulate something she'd never had to explain before. Because I didn't want to be hired as a volunteer because of my military experience, she said finally. I wanted to be accepted because of what I could contribute now, not because of what I had done in the past. Sarah nodded, understanding the distinction Margaret was making. But your military experience is part of what you contribute now, Sarah said. The way you handle family crises, the way you understand what people are going through, that comes from your medical training and your deployment experience, doesn't it? Margaret looked again at the certificate on her wall, then back at Sarah. It comes from understanding what it's like when everything is falling apart, and you need someone who knows what they're doing to help you through it, she said. I've been on both sides of that situation. Both sides? I've been the medic trying to save lives under impossible circumstances, Margaret said, and I've been the person waiting to find out if someone I cared about was going to survive. Sarah realized that Margaret was referring to something specific, something personal that had happened during her military service. Is that what the certificate is for? Sarah asked, glancing again at the framed document. Margaret followed Sarah's gaze to the wall. The Silver Star, she said quietly, for actions during a mass casualty event at Forward Operating Base Chapman in 2014. Sarah felt her breath catch. The Silver Star was the military's third highest decoration for valor, awarded for exceptional gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Margaret Chen wasn't just a former military medic. She was a decorated combat veteran who had been recognized for extraordinary heroism under fire. Margaret, Sarah said, I think there's a lot more to your story than I realized. Margaret looked at the materials she'd gathered for the family crisis waiting in the ICU. Right now, there's a family upstairs who needs help getting through the worst night of their lives, she said. The story can wait. They can't. Sarah recognized the deflection, but also understood Margaret's priorities. There would be time to learn about Margaret's military service later. Right now, people needed help, and Margaret was the person best qualified to provide it. As they walked toward the ICU together, Sarah found herself seeing Margaret differently, not just as an exceptional volunteer, but as someone whose entire approach to helping others had been shaped by experiences that most people couldn't imagine. The family crisis in the ICU lasted 14 hours. Robert Martinez, a 38-year-old construction foreman and father of 3, had fallen from scaffolding and sustained multiple internal injuries that required several emergency surgeries. His wife, Carmen, and their 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 12, spent the night in the family waiting room, alternating between hope and despair as medical teams worked to save Robert's life. Margaret stayed with the Martinez family through the entire ordeal, providing the kind of support that went far beyond standard volunteer protocols. She helped Carmen understand medical terminology, coordinated communication with extended family members, arranged for childcare when the younger children became too tired to stay awake, and most importantly, provided the steady, calm presence that families need during medical emergencies. Dr. Sarah Martinez observed Margaret's work throughout the night, and what she saw reinforced her suspicion that Margaret's volunteer skills were built on a foundation of professional medical experience. Margaret's ability to interpret changes in the medical team's body language, her understanding of hospital procedures, and her intuitive sense of when families needed specific types of support. These weren't skills that could be learned through volunteer training alone. When Robert Martinez finally stabilized and was moved to intensive care recovery at 6 a.m., the crisis phase was over. Carmen and the children would still face weeks of uncertainty as Robert recovered, but the immediate threat to his life had passed. As the family settled into the rhythm of ICU waiting, Margaret completed her shift and prepared to go home. But Sarah approached her before she left. Margaret, I wanted to thank you for what you did last night. That family got through this because of your support. Margaret accepted the thanks graciously. It's what I'm here for. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, Sarah said, about your military background. Would you be willing to tell me more about it? I'm curious about how you transitioned from combat medicine to volunteer work. Margaret considered the request, perhaps recognizing that Sarah's interest was professional rather than merely curious. Buy me breakfast? Margaret said. It's been a long night and this story requires coffee. An hour later, they sat in a diner near the hospital, both exhausted from the overnight crisis, but two wound up from adrenaline to go home immediately. Margaret cradled a large coffee cup in both hands and seemed to be gathering her thoughts about how to share a story she rarely told. "I enlisted in 2004, right out of high school," Margaret began. "I'd always been interested in medicine, but I couldn't afford college, so the Army seemed like a way to get medical training while serving my country." She paused to take a sip of coffee. "I completed combat medic training at Fort Sam, Houston, and was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. My first deployment was Iraq in 2006, then 2 tours in Afghanistan between 2010 and 2014. Sarah listened without interrupting, understanding that Margaret was sharing something she didn't often discuss. "Afghanistan was different from Iraq," Margaret continued. "More remote, less infrastructure, longer times between when soldiers were wounded and when they could reach definitive medical care. As a medic, you were often the only thing standing between a wounded soldier and death for hours at a time." "Is that where you earned the Silver Star?" Margaret nodded. "Fob Chapman, October 12, 2014. We took coordinated mortar and rocket attacks followed by a ground assault. The aid station took a direct hit in the first wave, killing 2 medics and wounding most of the medical staff." Margaret's voice remained steady, but Sarah could see the weight of the memory in her eyes. "I was the only medic left who could function, and we had 23 wounded soldiers scattered across the base. Some were critical, some were walking wounded, but all of them needed immediate medical attention. What did you do?" "What I was trained to do. I set up a triage area in the most protected location I could find and started working through the casualties. The attack lasted 4 hours, and I had to keep moving between wounded soldiers while incoming fire was still landing around us." Margaret paused, perhaps debating how much detail to share. "The citation says I repeatedly exposed myself to enemy fire to provide life-saving medical treatment to wounded personnel. What it doesn't say is that I was terrified every second of those 4 hours. But being terrified wasn't an option when people were bleeding to death." Sarah was beginning to understand the depth of Margaret's medical experience and the circumstances that had shaped her approach to crisis situations. "How many soldiers did you treat that night?" 23 wounded, 6 critical. All of them lived to be evacuated to higher levels of care. But the experience, it changed something in me." "Changed how?" Margaret looked out the diner window at the morning traffic beginning to build on the street outside. "I realized that being a medic wasn't just about medical skills. It was about being the person who stayed calm when everything was falling apart, who could function when other people couldn't, who could give people hope when there didn't seem to be any reason for hope." "That sounds like what you do at the hospital." "It is what I do at the hospital," Margaret said. "Same skills, same mission, just a different uniform and different circumstances." Sarah was beginning to understand how Margaret had transitioned from military to civilian service. "When did you retire from the Army?" 2016. I was medically retired after an IED explosion damaged my hearing and left me with some nerve damage in my right hand. Nothing dramatic, but enough to disqualify me from combat medic duties." "So you decided to volunteer at a hospital?" Margaret smiled for the first time since beginning her story. "I tried civilian life for about 6 months. Desk job, regular hours, comfortable routine. But I felt like I was wasting everything I'd learned, all the experience I'd gained. When I heard about the volunteer program at Memorial, it seemed like a way to use my medical background without having to explain my military service." Sarah understood why Margaret had chosen anonymity. The transition from decorated combat veteran to hospital volunteer was unusual, and Margaret had probably wanted to avoid the complexity of explaining her background to people who might not understand her motivations. "Do you miss it?" Sarah asked. "The military, the high-stakes medical work?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I miss the team, the sense of mission, the feeling that what you were doing mattered in life or death ways," she said. "But I've found that helping families through medical crises matters too, just in a different way. I'm still using the same skills, still serving people who need help, still being the calm person in chaotic situations. Sarah nodded, recognizing that Margaret had found a way to continue her military mission in a civilian context. Margaret, why keep it secret? Why not let people know about your background? Margaret finished her coffee before answering. Because I wanted people to judge my volunteer work on its own merits, not on my military record. I wanted families to trust me because of how I treated them, not because of decorations I earned in Afghanistan. Sarah understood Margaret's reasoning, but she also saw the missed opportunity. You realize that your military experience makes you uniquely qualified to help other veterans and military families who come through the hospital. Margaret looked at Sarah with renewed interest. What do you mean? We see military families all the time. Active duty personnel, veterans, spouses, and children of deployed soldiers. They face unique challenges that civilian volunteers don't always understand. Your background could be incredibly valuable to those families. Margaret hadn't considered this possibility, but Sarah could see her thinking about it. Would you be interested in expanding your volunteer work to include specific support for military families? Sarah asked. Margaret smiled again, and for the first time since Sarah had known her, she looked genuinely excited about a new challenge. I think I'd like that very much, she said. 3 months after Dr. Sarah Martinez discovered Margaret's Silver Star certificate, Memorial Hospital had quietly created a new volunteer position, Military Family Liaison. The role was designed specifically for Margaret, combining her existing family support work with specialized services for veterans, active duty military personnel, and their families who required medical care. The position wasn't advertised or announced. Margaret had requested that her military background not be used for publicity or recognition. Instead, word spread organically through the veteran community in Denver, and military families began specifically requesting Margaret's assistance when they faced medical crises. The difference Margaret's military experience made was immediately apparent. When Staff Sergeant James Wilson was brought to Memorial after an off-duty motorcycle accident, his wife and 2 young children were struggling not just with his injuries, but with the complex intersection of military and civilian medical systems. Margaret was able to help them navigate insurance issues, coordinate with military medical personnel, and understand how Wilson's treatment would affect his military career. She gets it, Wilson's wife Lisa told Dr. Martinez. She understands what it's like to be a military family dealing with civilian medical care. She knows what questions to ask and what problems we're going to face before we even realize them ourselves. Margaret's work with veteran patients was equally valuable. When 60-year-old Vietnam veteran Carl Rodriguez was admitted with complications from Agent Orange exposure, he was hostile and uncooperative with civilian medical staff who he felt didn't understand his military experience. Margaret was able to establish rapport with Rodriguez immediately, not by mentioning her own service, but by demonstrating the kind of understanding that only came from shared experience. You've been there, haven't you? Rodriguez asked Margaret during one of their conversations. I've been there, Margaret confirmed. Where? Afghanistan, 3 tours. Rodriguez nodded, and from that point forward, he became one of the most cooperative patients on the ward. Margaret's credibility with him wasn't based on her volunteer training. It was based on the mutual recognition that existed between veterans who had served in combat zones. But perhaps the most significant impact of Margaret's expanded role came in her work with military families facing end-of-life situations. When Marine Lance Corporal David Kim was brought to Memorial with traumatic brain injury sustained during a training accident, his parents faced the possibility of making decisions about life support for their 20-year-old son. Margaret spent 3 days with the Kim family, helping them understand David's medical condition, coordinating communication with military chaplains and family assistance officers, and most importantly, helping them process the devastating reality that their son, who had survived a deployment to Iraq, might not survive an accident at home. Margaret understood what David meant to us in ways that civilian counselors couldn't, Kim's mother later wrote in a letter to hospital administration. She understood that he wasn't just our son, he was a Marine, and that identity mattered to how we thought about his care and his dignity. When David Kim died 4 days after his accident, Margaret helped coordinate military funeral honors and connected the family with other Gold Star families who could provide ongoing support. The Kim family's experience with Margaret became the model for how Memorial Hospital approached end-of-life care for military families. Dr. Martinez observed these developments with professional satisfaction, understanding that Margaret's military background had transformed her from an exceptional volunteer into an irreplaceable resource for military families facing medical crises. "You've found your niche," Sarah told Margaret during one of their regular check-ins. "This work seems to energize you in ways that general volunteer work didn't." Margaret nodded. "It feels like coming home in a way. I'm using all of my experience, medical training, military culture, understanding of how deployment and military life affect families. For the first time since I retired from the Army, I feel like I'm using the full range of my capabilities." "Any regrets about keeping your military background secret for so long?" Margaret considered the question. "No regrets about the secrecy. I needed time to figure out how to be a civilian, how to find meaning in non-military work. But I'm glad the secret is out now. This feels like the work I was meant to be doing." 8 months after Margaret began working as Memorial Hospital's military family liaison, her expanded role had attracted attention beyond the hospital walls. Military family support organizations throughout Colorado had begun referring families to Margaret when they faced complex medical situations, and her reputation had spread through informal networks of veterans and military spouses. The recognition came to official attention when Colonel Patricia Williams, commander of the local Air Force base, visited Memorial Hospital to check on an airman who had been injured in a car accident. During her visit, the airman's wife mentioned that a volunteer named Margaret had been incredibly helpful in navigating the intersection of military and civilian medical care. "She's former Army," the wife explained. "Combat medic, I think. She just understood everything we were dealing with in ways that other people didn't." Colonel Williams made inquiries and learned about Margaret's role at the hospital. What she discovered was that Memorial Hospital had quietly created one of the most effective military family support programs in the region, built around a single volunteer whose military experience and medical background made her uniquely qualified for the work. "We need to recognize this," Colonel Williams told Dr. Martinez during a meeting to discuss military-civilian medical cooperation. "What Margaret is doing here is exactly the kind of veteran-to-veteran support that our families need, but it's rare to find someone with her combination of medical expertise and military experience." Dr. Martinez explained Margaret's preference for low-profile work and her reluctance to be publicly recognized for her military service. "She's not interested in ceremonies or awards," Dr. Martinez said. "She just wants to do the work." "I understand that," Colonel Williams replied, "but there are ways to honor her service without turning her into a poster child. Would she be willing to speak to military spouses about navigating medical crises? Not as a celebrity, but as someone who's been where they are?" Dr. Martinez thought Margaret might be receptive to that kind of recognition, sharing knowledge rather than receiving praise. When the suggestion was presented to Margaret, she was initially hesitant, but ultimately agreed to speak at a monthly meeting of military spouses from the local Air Force base. "I'm not comfortable talking about my medals or my decorations," Margaret told Dr. Martinez, "but I can talk about practical things, how to work with civilian medical systems, what questions to ask, how to advocate for family members who can't advocate for themselves." The presentation Margaret gave to 30 military spouses was focused, practical, and deeply informed by her own experience as both a medical professional and a military family member. She talked about insurance navigation, communication with medical teams, coordination between military and civilian medical systems, and the emotional challenges of medical crises when families were geographically separated by military assignments. But the most powerful part of Margaret's presentation came when she talked about the emotional aspects of medical crises. "When someone you love is seriously injured or critically ill, you feel helpless," Margaret said. "As military families, we're used to being strong, being independent, handling things on our own. But medical crises require you to depend on other people, to trust people you don't know, to accept help when you're used to providing help. She looked around the room at faces that clearly recognized the truth of what she was saying. The most important thing you can do is ask questions until you understand what's happening. Don't be polite about your family member's medical care. Be persistent, be informed, be the advocate they need you to be. Margaret's presentation was followed by an hour of questions that covered everything from insurance procedures to emotional coping strategies. The military spouses in attendance clearly saw Margaret as someone who understood their unique challenges in ways that civilian counselors and even military chaplains sometimes couldn't. After the presentation, Colonel Williams approached Margaret privately. "That was exactly what our families needed to hear," she said. "Would you be willing to do this regularly? Maybe quarterly presentations for military families in the area?" Margaret agreed, understanding that this was a way to extend her work beyond the hospital while maintaining her preference for service over recognition. "I have one request," Margaret said. "I don't want to be introduced as a Silver Star recipient or be recognized for my military decorations. I want to be introduced as someone who has experience with military medical situations, both as a medic and as a family member." Colonel Williams nodded. "I understand. It's about the knowledge, not the recognition." Exactly. 2 years after Dr. Sarah Martinez discovered Margaret's military background, Memorial Hospital's Military Family Liaison Program had become a model for other civilian hospitals throughout the region. Margaret had trained 3 additional volunteers who specialized in military family support, and her quarterly presentations to military spouses had evolved into a comprehensive educational program that addressed the full range of challenges military families faced when dealing with medical crises. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition of Margaret's work came from an unexpected source. A letter from Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, a soldier Margaret had treated at FOB Chapman in Afghanistan 8 years earlier. The letter had been forwarded through military channels after Santos had heard about Memorial Hospital's military family program and recognized Margaret's name in a news article about the hospital's veteran support services. "Dear Margaret," the letter began, "you probably don't remember me, but you saved my life at FOB Chapman in October 2014. I was one of the soldiers wounded when the aid station was hit by mortar fire. You treated my injuries and kept me stable until I could be evacuated." Margaret remembered the attack vividly, but she hadn't known the names or faces of many of the soldiers she'd treated that night. The chaos and darkness had made it difficult to form individual memories of the wounded personnel. "I wanted you to know that I made a full recovery and completed my military service in 2018, Santos continued. "I'm now working as a paramedic in civilian life, and I often think about that night when you showed me what it meant to stay calm under pressure and focus on helping others even when everything was falling apart." The letter went on to describe how Santos had been inspired by Margaret's example to pursue a career in emergency medical services, and how she had used lessons learned from Margaret's treatment during that night in Afghanistan throughout her own medical career. "I heard about the work you're doing at Memorial Hospital, helping military families navigate medical crises," Santos wrote. "It doesn't surprise me at all that you found a way to keep helping people after you left the Army. You taught me that being a medic isn't just about medical skills. It's about being the calm person in chaotic situations, the one who doesn't give up even when things look hopeless." Margaret read the letter 3 times, understanding for the first time that her military service had influenced not just the soldiers she'd treated during that night in Afghanistan, but their subsequent careers and approach to helping others. Dr. Martinez found Margaret in the volunteer office later that day, still holding Santos's letter. "Good news?" Sarah asked. Margaret handed her the letter. "Read this." After reading Santos's letter, Sarah looked at Margaret with new understanding. "You know what this means, don't you?" Sarah said. "What?" "Your service didn't end when you left the Army. It didn't even end when you started volunteering here. You've been serving continuously, first as a combat medic, then as a hospital volunteer, now as a military family advocate. And you've been teaching other people to serve, both directly and by example." Margaret looked at the Silver Star certificate on her wall, then at the stack of thank you letters from military families she'd helped at Memorial Hospital. "I never thought about it that way," she said. The soldiers you treated in Afghanistan, the families you've helped here, the volunteers you've trained, the military spouses you've educated. They're all part of the same mission. You've just been carrying it out in different uniforms in different contexts. Margaret nodded, beginning to understand that her transition from military to civilian life hadn't been a change of mission. It had been an evolution of the same fundamental commitment to serving others. The Silver Star was for one night in Afghanistan, Sarah continued. But what you've been doing for the past 8 years, that's service that continues every day. Margaret smiled, understanding that recognition wasn't about awards or ceremonies. It was about knowing that your work mattered and that the people you served were better off because of your efforts. I think I'd like to expand the program, Margaret said. Maybe train volunteers at other hospitals, develop educational materials for military families, create support networks for military medical situations. Sarah wasn't surprised by Margaret's ambition. Sounds like you've found your post-military mission. I think I found it 8 years ago, Margaret replied. It just took me a while to recognize it. 5 years later, Margaret Chen's military family medical support program had been implemented in 12 hospitals across Colorado, with training materials and protocols that she'd developed being used by civilian hospitals throughout the country. Margaret had trained over 40 volunteers who specialized in military family support, and her educational presentations had reached thousands of military spouses and family members. But the most important measure of Margaret's success wasn't the number of programs or volunteers she'd trained. It was the individual families who had received support during their most difficult moments. Families like the Martinez family, whose father had survived his construction accident and returned to work. Like the Kim family, who had found meaning and dignity in their son's death through military funeral honors. Like the Wilson family, who had navigated the complex intersection of military and civilian medical care with confidence and understanding. Margaret still worked at Memorial Hospital, though her role had evolved from volunteer to paid program coordinator. She still provided direct support to families during medical crises, but she also supervised other volunteers, developed training materials, and served as a consultant to hospitals throughout the region that wanted to create similar programs. The Silver Star certificate still hung on the wall of her office, but it was now surrounded by thank you letters from families, certificates of appreciation from military organizations, and photographs from training sessions and educational presentations. The wall had become a visual representation of Margaret's evolution from combat medic to military family advocate. Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had been promoted to chief of trauma surgery, often reflected on the day she'd accidentally discovered Margaret's military background. That single moment of curiosity had led to the creation of one of the most innovative military family support programs in the country. You changed the way we think about veteran services, Sarah told Margaret during one of their regular check-ins. Before we discovered your background, we thought of veterans as people who needed help. Now we understand that veterans can be resources for helping others. Margaret nodded. Military service teaches you skills that are valuable in civilian contexts, but it also teaches you values, commitment to others, willingness to serve, understanding that sometimes you have to put other people's needs ahead of your own. Those values don't disappear when you take off the uniform. Is that what you tell the veterans who want to get involved in the program? I tell them that service doesn't end when military service ends, it just changes form. The mission to help others, to be there when people need you, to use your skills and experience for something bigger than yourself. That mission continues for as long as you choose to accept it. Margaret looked around her office, seeing the evidence of 8 years of continuous service that had grown from a simple decision to volunteer at a hospital. The Silver Star was for actions I took during one night in Afghanistan, she said. But the work I've been doing since then, helping families, training volunteers, creating support systems for military families, that might be more important than anything I did in uniform. Sarah understood what Margaret meant. Military decorations recognized specific acts of heroism, but civilian service recognized sustained commitment to helping others over time. Different kinds of heroism, Sarah observed. Same kind of service, Margaret replied, just different contexts. Some heroes earn their recognition in moments of extraordinary courage under fire. Others earn it through years of quiet service that helps people navigate the ordinary crises that define human experience. Margaret Chen was both kinds of hero, but she preferred the second kind, because that's the kind that understands service is about showing up every day, being there when people need you, and using whatever skills and experience you have to make other people's lives a little bit better. And sometimes, the most important heroism happens in hospital waiting rooms, where families need someone who understands that medical crises are battles too, and that everyone deserves to have someone in their corner who knows how to fight for them. This story was brought to you by Daily Soldier Stories. Have you ever discovered that someone's compassion came from personal experience with struggle? Share their story in the comments. And if this reminded you that healing comes in many forms, subscribe to support the channel. Sometimes the greatest service happens not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when people need someone who understands what they're going through.